Chapter number 12 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 12. Claude Arion Helvetius. If France at the present day has not reason to be proud of its leading man, it has in former times produced those minds that shed lustre upon the country, and who, by their literature, add immortality to its renown. During the 18th century, when religious persecution and intolerance were rampant throughout Europe, France furnished men to check oppression and expose superstition, while others followed to lay the foundation of excellence and greatness in the examination and cultivation of its true source, the mind. Helvetius sought to direct men's attention to self examination, and to show how many disputes might be avoided if each person understood what he was disputing about. Helvetius on the Mind is a work that ought to be read widely, and studied attentively, especially by rising young men, as it is one of those secular works too rarely found among our literature. Claude Arion Helvetius was born in Paris in the year 1715. After his preparatory studies, he was sent to the college of Louis le Grand, having for his tutor the famous Poré, who bestowed additional attention upon Helvetius, perceiving in him great talent and genius. Early in life, Helvetius formed the friendship of some of the leading minds of France. Montesquieu being his intimate friend, Voltaire, too, sought his correspondence when at the age of 23, calling him his young Apollo and his son of Parnassus. The first literary attempts of Helvetius consisted of poetry, Epistles on Happiness, which appeared as a posthumous production with the lavish commendations of Voltaire. After 10 years' thought and study, Helvetius, in 1758, published a work entitled De l'Esprit, which brought upon him a great amount of persecution. The Parliament of Paris condemned it, and Helvetius was removed from the office he held of Maître d'Hôtel to the Queen. Voltaire remarks, "It is a little extraordinary that they should have persecuted, disgraced, and harassed a much respected philosopher of our days, the innocent, the good Helvetius, for having said that if men had been without hands, they could not have built houses or worked in tapestry." Apparently, those who have condemned this proposition have a secret for cutting stones and wood, and for sewing with the feet. I have no doubt that they will soon condemn to the galleys the first who shall have the insolence to say that a man cannot think without his head, for some bachelor will tell him the soul is a pure spirit, the head is nothing but matter. God can place the soul in the nails as well as in the skull, therefore I proscribe you as impious. During the persecution raised against him, Helvetius visited England in 1764. In 1765 he visited Prussia, being well received by Frederick, in whose place he lodged. Voltaire strongly advised Helvetius to leave France in these words: "In your place, I should not hesitate a moment to sell all that I have in France. There are some excellent estates in my neighborhood, and there you might cultivate in peace the arts you love." About this period, Hume became acquainted with Helvetius, whom he styles, in writing to Dr. Robertson, "a very fine genius and worthy man." In 1765, Helvetius returned from Prussia, and retired to his estate at Blois. The sight of misery much affected him, and when relieving distress, he enjoined strict secrecy. Sometimes, when told he relieved those undeserving his aid, he would say, "If I were a king, I would correct them; but as I am only rich, and they are poor, I do my duty in relieving them." An attack of gout in the head and stomach terminated his life in December, 1771, in the 56th year of his age. In De l'Esprit, or Essays on the Mind, chapter 1, Helvetius makes the following remarks on the mind considered in itself: "We hear each day disputes with regard to what ought to be called the mind. Each person delivers his thoughts, but annexes different ideas to the word, and thus the debate is continued, without understanding each other. In order, therefore, to enable us to give a just and precise idea of the word mind, and its different acceptations, it is necessary first to consider the mind in itself. We consider the mind either as the effect of the faculty of thinking, and in this sense the mind is no more than an assemblage of our thoughts; or we consider it as the very faculty of thinking. But in order to understand what is meant by the mind in the latter acceptation, we ought previously to know the productive causes of our ideas. Man has two faculties, or, if I may be allowed the expression, two passive powers, whose existence is generally and distinctly acknowledged. The one is the faculty of receiving the different impressions caused by external objects, and is called physical sensibility. The other is the faculty of preserving the impressions caused by those objects, called memory. And memory is nothing more than a continued but weakened sensation. Those faculties which I consider as the productive causes of our thoughts, and which we have in common with beasts, would produce but a very small number of ideas, if they were not assisted by certain external organizations. If nature, instead of hands and flexible fingers, had terminated our wrist with the foot of a horse, mankind would doubtless have been totally destitute of art, habitation, and defense against other animals. Wholly employed in the care of procuring food and avoiding the beasts of prey, they would have still continued wandering in the forests like fugitive flocks. It is therefore evident that, according to this supposition, the police would never have been carried in any society to that degree of perfection to which it is now arrived. There is not a nation now existing, but, with regard to the action of the mind, must not have continued very inferior to certain savage nations, who have not 200 different ideas, nor 200 words to express those ideas, and whose language must consequently be reduced, like that of animals, to 5 or 6 different sounds or cries. If we take from it the words bow, arrow, nets, etc., which suppose the use of hands, from whence I conclude that without a certain exterior organization, sensibility and memory in us would prove two sterile faculties. We ought to examine if these two faculties, by the assistance of this organization, have in reality produced all our thoughts. But before we examine this subject, I may possibly be asked whether these two faculties are modifications of a spiritual or a material substance. This question, which has formerly been so often debated by philosophers, and by some persons revived in our time, does not necessarily fall within the limits of my work. What I have to offer with regard to the mind is equally conformable to either of these hypotheses. I shall therefore only observe, that if the Church had not fixed our belief in respect to this particular, and we had been obliged by the light of reason alone to acquire a knowledge of the thinking principle, we must have granted that neither opinion is capable of demonstration, and consequently, that by weighing the reasons on both sides, balancing the difficulties, and determining in favor of the greater number of probabilities, we should form only conditional judgments. It would be the fate of this problem, as it hath been of many others, to be resolvable only by the assistance of the calculation of probabilities. Helvetius, on the question whether genius ought to be considered as a natural gift or as an effect of education, says: "I am going to examine in this discourse what the mind receives from nature and education; for which purpose it is necessary first to determine what is here meant by the word nature. This word may raise in our minds a confused idea of a being or a force that has endued us with all our senses. Now the senses are the sources of all our ideas. Being deprived of our senses, we are deprived of all the ideas relative to them. A man born blind has for this reason no idea of colors. It is then evident that, in this signification, genius ought to be considered as a gift of nature. But if the word be taken in a different acceptation, and we supposed that among the men well formed and endued with all their senses, without any perceivable defect of their organization, nature has made such a remarkable difference, and formed such an unequal distribution of the intellectual powers, that one shall be so organized as to be stupid, and the other be a man of genius, the question will become more delicate. I confess that at first we cannot consider the great inequality in the minds of men, without admitting that there is the same difference between them as between bodies, some of which are weak and delicate, while others are strong and robust. What can here occasion such variations from the uniform manner wherein nature operates? This reasoning, it is true, is founded only on analogy. It is like that of the astronomers who conclude that the moon is inhabited, because it is composed of nearly the same matter as our earth. How weak soever this reasoning may be, it must yet appear demonstrative; for, say they, to what cause can be attributed the great disproportion of intellects observable between people who appear to have had the same education? In order to reply to this objection, it is proper first to inquire, whether several men can, strictly speaking, have the same education, and for this purpose to fix the idea included in the word education. If by education we merely understand that received in the same places and under the same masters, in this sense the education is the same with an infinite number of men. But if we give to this word a more true and extensive signification, and in general comprehend everything that relates to our instruction, then I say that nobody receives the same education, because each individual has for his preceptors, if I may be allowed to say so, the form of government under which he lives, his friends, his mistresses, the people about him, whatever he reads, and in short, chance; that is, an infinite number of events with respect to which our ignorance will not permit us to perceive their causes, and the chain that connects them together. Now this chance has a greater share in our education than is imagined. It is this places certain objects before us, and in consequence of this, occasions more happy ideas, and sometimes leads to the greatest discoveries. To give some examples, it was chance that conducted Galileo into the gardens of Florence, when the gardeners were working the pumps. It was that which inspired those gardeners, when, not being able to raise the water above the height of 32 feet, to ask him the cause, and by that question piqued the vanity of the philosopher, put in action by so casual a question, that obliged him to make this natural effect the subject of his thoughts, till at last, by discovering the weight of the air, he found the solution of the problem. In the moment when the peaceful soul of Newton was employed by no business and agitated by no passion, it was also chance that, drawing him under an apple tree, loosened some of the fruit from the branches, and gave that philosopher the first idea of his system on gravitation. It was really this incident that afterwards made him turn his thoughts to inquire whether the moon does not gravitate towards the earth with the same force as that which bodies fall on its surface. It is then to chance that great geniuses are frequently obliged for their most happy thoughts. How many great minds are confounded among the people of moderate capacities, for want of a certain tranquillity of soul, the question of a gardener, or the fall of an apple. Of the exclusive qualities of the mind and soul, Helvetius observes: "My view in the preceding chapters was to affix clear ideas to the several qualities of the mind. I propose in this to examine if there are talents that must necessarily exclude each other. This question, it is said, is determined by facts. No person is, at the same time, superior to all others in many different kinds of knowledge. Newton is not reckoned among the poets, nor Milton among the geometricians. The verses of Leibnitz are bad. There is not a man who, in a single art, as poetry or painting, has succeeded in all the branches of it. Corneille and Racine have done nothing in comedy comparable to Molière. Michelangelo has not drawn the pictures of Albani, nor Albani painted those of Julius Romano. The genius of the greatest men appears then to be confined within very narrow limits. This is doubtless true, but I ask, what is the cause? Is it time, or is it wit, which men want to render themselves illustrious in the different arts and sciences? The progress of the human mind, it is said, ought to be the same in all the arts and sciences. The operations of the mind are reduced to the knowledge of the resemblances and differences that subsist between various objects. It is then by observation that we obtain, in all the different kinds of study, the new and general ideas on which our superiority depends. Every great physician, every great chemist, may then become a great geometrician, a great astronomer, a great politician, and the first, in short, in all the sciences. This fact being stated, it will doubtless be concluded that it is the short duration of human life that forces superior minds to limit themselves to one kind of study. It must, however, be confessed that there are talents and qualities possessed only by the exclusion of some others. Among mankind, some are filled with the love of glory, and are not susceptible of any other of the passions. Some may excel in natural philosophy, civil law, geometry, and, in short, in all the sciences that consist in the comparison of ideas. A fondness for any other study can only distract or precipitate them into errors. There are other men susceptible not only of the love of glory, but an infinite number of other passions. These may become celebrated in different kinds of study, where the success depends on being moved. Such is, for instance, the dramatic kind of writing. But in order to paint the passions, we must, as I have already said, feel them very warmly. We are ignorant both of the language of the passions and of the sensations they excite in us. when we have not experienced them. Thus ignorance of this kind always produces mediocrity. If Fontenelle had been obliged to paint the characters of Rhadamistus, Brutus, or Catiline, that great man would certainly have fallen much below mediocrity. Let a man, for instance, like M. de Fontenelle, contemplate, without severity, the wickedness of mankind. Let him consider it, let him rise up against crimes, without hating the criminals, and people will applaud his moderation, and yet, at the same instant, they will accuse him of being too lukewarm in friendship. They do not perceive that the same absence of the passions to which he owes the moderation they commend, must necessarily render him less sensible of the charms of friendship. The abuse of words by different schools of philosophers is thus ably pointed out. Descartes had before Locke observed that the Peripatetics, entrenching themselves behind the obscurity of words, were not unlike a blind man, who, in order to be a match for his clear sighted antagonist, should draw him into a dark cavern. Now, added he, if this man can introduce light into the cavern, and compel the Peripatetics to fix clear ideas to their words, the victory is his own. In imitation of Descartes and Locke, I shall show that, both in metaphysics and morality, the abuse of words, and the ignorance of their true import, is a labyrinth in which the greatest geniuses have lost themselves; and, in order to set this particular in a clear light, instance in some of those words which have given rise to the longest and sharpest disputes among philosophers, such in metaphysics are matter, space, and infinite. It has at all times been alternately asserted that matter felt or did not feel, and given rise to disputes equally loud and vague. It was very late before it came into the disputants' heads to ask one another what they were disputing about, and to annex a precise idea to the word matter. Had they at first fixed the meaning of it, they would have perceived, if I may use the expression, that men were the creators of matter, that matter was not a being, that in nature there were only individuals to which the name of body had been given, and that this word matter could import no more than the collection of properties common to all bodies. The meaning of this word being determined, all that remained was to know whether extent, solidity, and impenetrability were the only properties common to all bodies, and whether the discovery of a power, such, for instance, as attraction, might not give rise to a conjecture that bodies had some properties hitherto unknown, such as that of sensation, which, though evident only in the organized members of animals, might yet be common to all individuals. The question being reduced to this, it would have appeared that, if strictly speaking, it is impossible to demonstrate that all bodies are absolutely insensible, no man, unless instructed by a particular revelation, can decide the question otherwise than by calculating and comparing the verisimilitude of this opinion with that of the contrary. Instructed by the errors of great men who have gone before us, we should be sensible that our observations, however multiplied and concentrated, are scarcely sufficient to form one of those partial systems comprehended in the general systems. Add that it is from the depth of imagination that the several systems of the universe have hitherto been drawn, and as our informations of remote countries are always imperfect, so the informations philosophers have of the system of the world are also defective. With a great genius and a multitude of combinations, the products of their labors will be only fictions till time and chance shall furnish them with a general fact to which all others may be referred. What I have said of the word matter, I say also of space. Most of the philosophers have made a being of it, and the ignorance of the true sense of the word has occasioned long disputes. They would have been greatly shortened by annexing a clear idea to this word; for then the sages would have agreed that space, considered in bodies, is what we call extension; that we owe the idea of a void, which partly composes the idea of space, to the interval seen betwixt two lofty mountains; an interval which, being filled only by air, that is, by a body which at a certain distance makes no sensible impression on us, must have given us an idea of a vacuum, being nothing more than a power of representing to ourselves mountains separated from each other, and the intervening distances not being filled by other bodies. With regard to the idea of infinite, comprehended also within the idea of space, I say that we owe this idea of infinite only to the power which a man standing on a plane has of continually extending its limits, the boundary of his imagination not being determinable. The absence of limits is therefore the only idea we can form of infinite. Had philosophers, previously to their giving any opinion on this subject, determined the signification of the word infinite, I am inclined to believe they would have adopted the above definition, and not spent their time in frivolous disputes. To the false philosophy of former ages, our gross ignorance of the true signification of words is principally owing, as the art of abusing them made up the greatest part of that philosophy. This art, in which the whole science of the schools consisted, confounded all ideas, and the obscurity it threw on the expressions generally diffused itself over all the sciences, especially morality. The following remarks show Helvetius's notions of the love of glory. By the word strong passion, I mean a passion the object of which is so necessary to our happiness, that without the possession of it life would be insupportable. This was Omar's idea of the passion, when he said, "Whoever thou art that lovest liberty, desirest to be wealthy without riches, powerful without subjects, a subject without a master, dare to condemn death, kings will then tremble before thee, whilst thou alone shalt fear no person." It was the passion of honor and philosophic fanaticism alone that could induce Timitia the Pythagorean, in the midst of torture, to bite off her tongue, that she might not expose herself to reveal the secrets of her sect. Cato, when a child, going with his tutor to Sylla's palace, at seeing the bloody heads of the proscribed, asked with impatience the name of the monster who had caused so many Roman citizens to be murdered, he was answered, it was Sylla. "How," he says, "does Sylla murder thus, and is Sylla still alive?" "Yes," it was replied, "the very name of Sylla disarms our citizens." "Oh, Rome," cried Cato, "deplorable is thy fate, since within the vast compass of thy walls not a man of virtue can be found, and the arm of a feeble child is the only one that will oppose itself against tyranny." Then turning towards his governor, "Give me," said he, "your sword. I will conceal it under my robe, approach Sylla, and kill him. Cato lives, and Rome is again free." If the generous pride, the passion of patriotism and glory, determines citizens to such heroic actions, with what resolution and intrepidity do not the passions inspire those who aim at distinction in the arts and sciences, and whom Cicero calls the peaceable heroes? It is from a desire of glory that the astronomer is seen, on the icy summits of the Cordilleras, placing his instruments in the midst of snows and frost, which conducts the botanist to the brinks of precipices in quest of plants, which anciently carried the juvenile lovers of the sciences into Egypt, Ethiopia, and even into the Indies, for visiting the most celebrated philosophers, and acquiring from their conversation the principles of their doctrine. How strongly did this passion exert itself in Demosthenes, who, for perfecting his pronunciation, used every day to stand on the sea shore, and with his mouth full of pebbles harangue the agitated waves. It was from the same desire of glory that the young Pythagoreans submitted to a silence of 3 years, in order to habituate themselves to recollection and meditation. It induced Democritus to shun the distractions of the world, and retire among the tombs, to meditate on those valuable truths, the discovery of which, as it is always very difficult, is also very little esteemed. In fine, it was this that prompted Heraclitus to cede to his younger brother the throne of Ephesus, to which he had the right of primogeniture, that he might give himself up entirely to philosophy, which made the athletic improve his strength, by denying himself the pleasures of love. It was also from a desire of popular applause that certain ancient priests renounced the same pleasures, and often, as Boynton pleasantly observes of them, without any other recompense for their continence than the perpetual temptation it occasions. Because, says Cardinal Richelieu, why a timorous mind perceives an impossibility in the most simple projects, when to an elevated mind the most arduous seems easy, is because before the latter the mountains sink, and before the former molehills are metamorphosed into mountains. The different motives that influence our conduct are thus stated. A mother idolizes her son. I love him, she says, for his own sake. However, one might reply, you take no care of his education, though you are in no doubt that a good one would contribute infinitely to his happiness. Why, therefore, do not you consult some men of sense about him, and read some of the works written on this subject? Why, because, says she, I think I know as much of this matter as those authors and their works. But how did you get this confidence in your own understanding? Is it not the effect of your indifference? An ardent desire always inspires us with a salutary distrust of ourselves. If we have a suit at law of considerable consequence, we visit counsellors and attorneys, we consult a great number, and examine their advice. Are we attacked by any of those lingering diseases which incessantly place around us the shades and horrors of death? We seek physicians, compare their opinions, read physical books. We ourselves become little physicians. Such is the conduct prompted by a warm interest. With respect to the education of children, if you are not influenced in the same manner, it is because you do not love your son as well as yourself. But, adds the mother, what then should be the motive of my tenderness? Among fathers and mothers, I reply, some are influenced by the desire of perpetuating their name in their children. They properly love only their names. Others are fond of command, and see in their children their slaves. The animal leaves its young when their weakness no longer keeps them in dependence, and paternal love becomes extinguished in almost all hearts when children have, by their age or station, attained to independence. Then, said the poet Sadi, the father sees nothing in them but greedy heirs, and this is the cause, adds some poet, of the extraordinary love of the grandfather for his grandchildren. He considers them as the enemies of his enemies. There are, in short, fathers and mothers who make their children their playthings and their pastime. The loss of this plaything would be insupportable to them, but would their affliction prove that they loved the child for itself? Everybody knows this passage in the life of M. de Lauzun. He was in the Bastille. there without books, without employment, a prey to lassitude and the horrors of a prison, he took it in his head to tame a spider. This was the only consolation he had left in his misfortune. The governor of the Bastille, from an inhumanity common to men accustomed to see the unhappy, crushed the spider. The prisoner felt the most cutting grief, and no mother could be affected by the death of a son with a more violent sorrow. Now whence is derived this conformity of sentiments for such different objects? It is because in the loss of a child, or in the loss of the spider, people frequently weep for nothing but for the lassitude and want of employment into which they fall. If mothers appear in general more afflicted at the death of a child than fathers employed in business, or given up to the pursuit of ambition, it is not because the mother loves her child more tenderly, but because she suffers a loss more difficult to be supplied. The errors, in my opinion, are in this respect very frequent. People rarely cherish a child for its own sake. That paternal love, of which so many men make a parade, and by which they believe themselves so warmly affected, is most frequently nothing more than an effect, either of a desire of perpetuating their names, or pride of command. Do you not know that Galileo was unworthily dragged to the prison of the Inquisition for having maintained that the sun is placed in the center, and does not move around the earth? That his system first offended the weak, and appeared directly contrary to that text of Scripture, "Sun, stand thou still." However, able divines have since made Galileo's principles agree with those of religion. Who has told you that a divine more happy or more enlightened than you will not remove the contradiction, which you think you perceive between your religion and the opinion you resolve to condemn? Who forces you by a precipitate censure to expose, if not religion, at least its ministers, to the hatred excited by persecution? Why, always borrowing the assistance of force and terror, would you impose silence on men of genius, and deprive mankind of the useful knowledge they are capable of dispensing? You obey, you say, the dictates of religion, but it commands you to distrust yourselves, and to love your neighbor. If you do not act in conformity to these principles, you are then not actuated by the Spirit of God. But you say, by whom then are we inspired? By laziness and pride. It is laziness, the enemy of thought, which makes you averse to those opinions which you cannot, without study and some fatigue of attention, unite with the principles received in the schools, but which, being proved to be philosophically true, cannot be theologically false. It is pride, which is ordinarily carried to a greater height in the bigot than in any other person, which makes him detest in the man of genius the benefactor of the human race, and which exasperates him against the truths discovered by humility. It is then this laziness and this pride, which, disguising themselves under the appearance of zeal, render them the persecutors of men of learning, and which in Italy, Spain, and Portugal have forged chains, built gibbets, and held the torch to the piles of the Inquisition. Thus the same pride which is so formidable in the devout fanatic, and which in all religions makes him persecute, in the name of the Most High, the men of genius, sometimes arms against them the men in power. After the examples of those Pharisees who treated as criminals the persons who did not adopt all their decisions, how many viziers treat as enemies to the nation those who do not blindly approve their conduct? End of chapter 12. Recorded by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Chapter 13 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Chapter 13. Francis W. d'Arusmont. The previous issues of this publication contain notices of the lives and writings of men of eminence in the world of free thought. This number is devoted to a review of the career and works of a most talented and accomplished lady, a freethinker and republican, as a proof, if any proof were needed, that women, if adequately educated, are equally capable with men to become teachers and reformers. The works of the subject of present notice afford abundant evidence. The efforts now being made to procure an adjustment of the laws relating to women, whereby they will be protected in their property, and consequently improved in their social position, deserve the support of all classes. When females become independent, there will be less ignorance among women and more happiness among men. Frances Wright, afterwards Madame d'Arusmont, was a native of Dundee. She was born on the 6th of September, 1795. She came of a wealthy family, who had been extensive holders of city property from the year 1500. Her father was a man of considerable literary attainments, and to his active antiquarian researches and donations the British Museum is indebted for many rare and valuable coins and medals. He died young, as also his wife, leaving 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. Frances was then but 2 years and a half old. At the wish of her grandfather, General Duncan Campbell, she was taken to England, and reared as a ward of Chancery, under the guardianship of a maternal aunt. She grew to be very tall in person, erect, and of a commanding figure, large eyes, and magnificent head, with a face somewhat masculine, but well formed, and decidedly handsome. Her brother was sent to India, at the age of 15, as a cadet in the East India Company's service, and was killed on the passage out in an encounter with a French vessel. Her sister passed her life with her, and died in Paris in 1831. At an early age, Miss Wright gave evidence of great intellectual ability. The education she received was of a very superior kind. She diligently applied herself to the various branches of science, and to the study of ancient and modern letters and the arts, being impelled by a strong desire for knowledge. At the age of 19, she published her first work, A Few Days in Athens. Her attention was early drawn to the sufferings of the lower classes, and on reflection she became convinced that some great vice lay at the foundation of the whole of human practice. She determined to endeavor to discover and assist in removing it. She read Bocca's History of the American Revolution, and resolved to visit that country, it appearing to her young imagination as the land of freedom and hope. After having familiarized herself with the government and institutions of America, she sailed for New York in 1818. She returned to England in 1820, and published a large volume, entitled Views of Society and Manners in America. It was dedicated to Jeremy Bentham, and had a large sale. The work being translated into most of the continental languages, she became known to the prominent reformers of Europe. In 1821 she made her first visit to Paris, and was there introduced to General Lafayette, who, having previously read her work on America, invited her to that city. A republican in all her views and hopes, she was highly appreciated by Lafayette and other eminent supporters of the liberal party in France. She remained in Paris until 1824, when she returned to the United States, and immediately undertook a project for the abolition of slavery, upon a plan somewhat different from any that then engaged the attention of philanthropists. For this purpose she purchased 2,000 acres of land at Chickasaw Bluff, now Memphis, Tennessee, intending to make a good farm rather than a cotton plantation. She then purchased several slave families, gave them their liberty, and removed them to the farm, residing there herself to direct their labor. Commencing this novel undertaking with all that enthusiasm for which she was remarkable, she continued the experiment some 3 years and a half, when her health gave way, and, suffering under severe sickness, she made a voyage to Europe for her recovery. During her absence, the farm got involved in difficulties by the influence of her enemies, and finally, the whole project falling through, the negroes were sent off to Hayti at her expense. She gave much time and money to the carrying forward of this experiment, and though it was a failure, it strikingly exhibited her strong sympathy and benevolence for an oppressed and degraded class of beings. Returning from Europe, she went to New Harmony, Indiana, to assume the proprietorship of a periodical, the Harmony Gazette, which had been published under the direction of Robert Dale Owen. In 1828, leaving Mr. Owen in charge of the paper, she began a lecturing tour through the Union, and probably no man, and certainly no woman, ever met with such furious opposition. Her views, as announced in her paper, had made her generally known, and, being somewhat new and radically anti theological, brought down upon her head the rancor of religious bigotry. As no church or hall would be opened for her, she lectured in theatres, and her ability and eloquence drew great audiences. On one occasion, while preparing to lecture in a theatre at Baltimore, she was threatened with the destruction of her life if she attempted to speak. She calmly replied, that she thought she knew the American people, and for every riotous fanatic that might annoy her, 100 good citizens would protect her, and she was not afraid to place herself in their hands. She judged rightly. She went to the theatre, which was crammed from pit to ceiling, and lectured to an admiring and enthusiastic audience. In other cities she was not always so fortunate. More or less rioting occurred, while the press, almost without exception, denounced her in the bitterest terms. Subsequently, her paper was removed to New York. Some years afterwards, she again made a lecturing tour, but this time she spoke on subjects of a political nature, and met with a better reception. In addition to lecturing, she conducted a political magazine, entitled "The Manual of American Principles," and was also engaged with Mr. Kneeland in editing the Boston Investigator. She wrote a great deal, and upon many subjects. Among her many works is a tragedy called Altorf, which was performed on the stage, the principal character being sustained by Mr. James Wallack. Her last work of any considerable size was entitled England the Civilizer, published in London in 1847. Madame d'Arusmont died suddenly in Cincinnati, on Tuesday, December 14th, 1852, aged 57. She had been for some time unwell, in consequence of a fall upon the ice the previous winter, which broke her thigh, and probably hastened her decease. But the immediate cause of her death was the rupture of a blood vessel. She was aware of her situation, knew when she was dying, and met her last hour with perfect composure. A daughter, her only child, survives her. In a small work entitled Observations on Religion and Civilization, are given the following definitions of theology and religion. in the words and in the things signified. Origin and nature of theology. Theology, from the Greek theos, logos, renders distinct the meaning of the subject it attempts to treat. Theos, God or gods, unseen beings and unknown causes. Logos, word, talk, or, if we like to employ yet more familiar and expressive terms, prattle or chatter. Talk or prattle about unseen beings or unknown causes. The idleness of the subject, and inutility, nay, absolute insanity of the occupation, sufficiently appears in the strict etymological meaning of the word employed to typify them. The danger, the mischief, the cruelly immoral, and, if I may be permitted to coin a word for the occasion, the unhumanizing tendencies, both of the subject and the occupation, when and where these are, as they have for the most part ever been throughout the civilized world, absolutely protected by law and upheld by government, sufficiently appear also from the whole page of history. Religion, from the Latin religio, renders with equal distinctness the things signified. Religio, to tie over again, to bind fast. Religio, a binding together, a bond of union. The importance of the great reality, here so accurately shadowed out, appears sufficiently in the etymological signification of the word. Its utility will be evident if we read with intelligence the nature, the past history, the actual condition, and the future destiny of man. But now, taking these two things in the most strict etymological sense of the words which express them, it will readily be distinguished that the first is a necessary creation of the human intellect in a certain stage of inquiry; the second, a necessary creation of the human soul, by which I understand both our intellectual and moral faculties taken conjointly, and in any and every state of human civilization. Theology argues in its origin the first awakening of human attention to the phenomena of nature, and the first crude efforts of human ingenuity to expound them. While man sees the sun and stars, without observing either their diurnal or their annual revolutions; while he receives upon his frame the rain and the wind, and the varying elements, without observing either their effects on himself or upon the field of nature around him, he is as the brute which suffers and enjoys without inquiring why it experiences light or darkness, pain or pleasure. When first he puts, in awkward language, to himself or to his fellow, the question, why does such an effect follow such a cause, he commences his existence, if not as a reasonable being, a state at which he has not yet arrived, at least as a being capable of reason. The answer to this first inquiry of awakening intelligence is, of course, such as his own circumscribed observation supplies. It is, in fine, in accordance with the explanation of the old nurse to the child, who, asking, when startled by a rolling peal of thunder, "What makes that noise?" was fully satisfied by the reply, "My darling, it is God Almighty overhead, moving his furniture." Man, awakening to the thought, but still unfamiliar with the concatenation of natural phenomena, inevitably conceives of some huge being, or beings, bestriding the clouds and whirlwind, or wheeling the sun and the moon like chariots through the blue vault. And so again, fancy most naturally peoples the gloom of the night with demons, the woods and the waters with naiads and dryads, elves and fairies, the churchyard with ghosts, and the dark cave and the solitary cot with wizards.
imps, and old witches. Such then is theology in its origin, and in all its stages we find it varying in grossness according to the degree of ignorance of the human mind, and refining into verbal subtleties and misty metaphysics in proportion as that mind exchanges, in its progress from darkness to light, the gloom of ignorance for the mass of terror. The nature of belief in the unknowable, and the dire consequences arising from fanaticism, are ably depicted in the following passages, selected from Lecture IV on Religion. Admitting religion to be the most important of all subjects, its truths must be the most apparent. For we shall readily concede, both that a thing true must be always of more or less importance, and that a thing essentially important must always be indisputably true. Now, again, I conceive we shall be disposed to admit that exactly in proportion to the indisputability of a truth is the proof it is capable of affording, and that exactly in proportion to the proof afforded is our admission of such truth and belief in it. If, then, religion be the most important subject of human inquiry, it must be that also which represents the most forcible, irrefragable, and indisputable truths to the inquirer. It must be that on which the human mind can err the least, and where all minds must be the most agreed. If religion be at once a science and the most true of all sciences, its truths must be as indisputable as those in any branch of the mathematics, as apparent to all the senses as those revealed by the chemist, or observed by the naturalist, and as easily referred to the test of our approving or disapproving sensations as those involved in the science of morals. Is religion a science? Is it a branch of knowledge? Where are the things known upon which it rests? Where are the accumulated facts of which it is compounded? What are the human sensations to which it appeals? Knowledge is compounded of things known. It is an accumulation of facts, gleaned by our senses within the range of material existence, which is subject to their investigation. Now let us see where, in the table of knowledge, we may class religion. Of what part or division of nature, or material existence does it treat? What bodies, or what properties of tangible bodies, does it place in contact with our senses, and bring home to the perception of our faculties? It clearly appertains not to the table of human knowledge, for it treats not of objects discoverable within the field of human observation. No, will you say? But its knowledge is superhuman, unearthly, its field is in heaven. My friends, the knowledge which is not human is of slippery foundation to us human creatures. Things known constitute knowledge, and here is a science treating of things unseen, unfelt, uncomprehended. Such cannot be knowledge. What then is it? Probability, possibility, theory, hypothesis, tradition? Written, spoken, by whom? When? Where? Let its teachers, nay, let all earth reply. But what confusion of tongues and voices now strike on the ear! From either Indies, from torrid Africa, from the frozen regions of either pole, from the vast plains of ancient Asia, from the fields and cities of European industry, from the palaces of European luxury, from the soft chambers of priestly ease, from the domes of hierarchical dominion, from the deep cell of the self-immolated monk, from the stony cave of the self-denying anchorite, from the cloud-capped towers, spires, and minarets of the crescent and the cross, arise shouts and hosannas and anathemas in the commingled names of Brahma and Vishnu and Krishna and Juggernaut. Heavenly kings, heavenly queens, triune deities, earth-born gods, heaven-born prophets, apotheosized monarchs, demon-enlightened philosophers, saints, angels, devils, ghosts, apparitions, and sorceries. But worse than these sounds which but stun the ear and confound the intellect, what sights, O humankind, appall the heart! The rivers of earth run blood, nation set against nation, brother against brother, man against the companion of his bosom, and that soft companion maddened with the frenzy of insane remorse for imaginary crimes, fired with the rage of infatuated bigotry, or subdued to diseased helplessness and mental fatuity, renounces kindred, flies from social converse, and pines away a useless or mischievous existence in sighings and tremblings, spectral fears, uncharitable feelings, and bitter denunciations. Such are thy doings, O religion, or rather, such are thy doings, O man. While standing in a world so rich in sources of enjoyment, so stored with objects of real inquiry and attainable knowledge, yet shutting thine eyes, and worse, thine heart, to the tangible things and sentient creatures around thee, and winging thy diseased imagination beyond the light of the sun which gladdens thy world, and contemplation of the objects which are here to expand thy mind and quicken the pulses of thy heart, I will pray ye to observe how much of our positive misery originates in our idle speculations in matters of faith, and in our blind, our fearful forgetfulness of facts, our cold, heartless, and I will say insane indifference to visible causes of tangible evil, and visible sources of tangible happiness. Look to the walks of life, I beseech ye. Look into the public prints. Look into your sectarian churches. Look into the bosoms of families. Look into your own bosoms, and those of your fellow beings, and see how many of our disputes and dissensions, public and private, how many of our unjust actions, how many of our harsh judgments, how many of our uncharitable feelings spring out of our ignorant ambition to rend the veil which wraps from our human senses the knowledge of things unseen, and from our human faculties the conception of causes unknown. And oh, my fellow beings, do not these very words, unseen and unknown, warn the enthusiast against the profanity of such inquiries, and proclaim to the philosopher their futility? Do they not teach us that religion is no subject for instruction, and no subject for discussion? Will they not convince us that as beyond the horizon of our observation we can know nothing, so within that horizon's the only safe ground for us to meet in public? Every day we see sects splitting, creeds new modeling, and men forsaking old opinions only to quarrel about their opposites. I see three gods in one, says the Trinitarian, and excommunicates the Socinian, who sees a Godhead in unity. I see a heaven but no hell, says the Universalist, and disowns fellowship with such as may distinguish less. I see a heaven and hell also, beyond the stars, said lately the orthodox friend, and expelled his shorter sighted brethren from the sanctuary. I seek them both in the heart of man, said the more spiritual follower of Penn, and straightway builded him up another temple, in which to quarrel with his neighbor, who perhaps only employs other words to express the same ideas. For myself, pretending to no insight into these mysteries, possessing no means of intercourse with the inhabitants of other worlds, confessing my absolute incapacity to see either as far back as a first cause, or as far forward as a last one, I am content to state to you, my fellow creatures, that all my studies, reading, reflection, and observation have obtained for me no knowledge beyond the sphere of our planet, our earthly interests, and our earthly duties; and that I more than doubt whether, should you expend all your time and all your treasure in the search, you will be able to acquire any better information respecting unseen worlds and future events than myself. The philosophical romance, A Few Days in Athens, though the first of Miss Wright's works, and written when she was very young, displays considerable power and eloquence. It is the most pleasing of all her writings. It is intended to portray the doctrines of Epicurus, and gives a picture of the Gargettian and the gardens of the Academy, surrounded by his pupils, calculated to counteract many of the popular and erroneous notions entertained of that philosopher's teachings. The following dialogue between Epicurus and his favorite, Theon, will afford the readers of the Half Hours an opportunity of judging how far Miss Wright has conveyed a truthful idea of Epicurus's ethical philosophy. On leaving you last night, said Theon, I encountered Cleanthes. He came from the perusal of your writings, and brought charges against them, which I was unprepared to answer. Let us hear them, my son. Perhaps, until you shall have perused them yourself, we may assist your difficulty. First, that they deny the existence of the gods. I see but one other assertion that could equal that in folly, said Epicurus. I knew it, exclaimed Theon triumphantly. I knew it was impossible. But where will not prejudice lead men, when even the uptight Cleanthes is capable of slander? He is utterly incapable of it, said the master, and in the accuracy, in this case, I rather suspect to rest with you than with him. To deny the existence of the gods would indeed be a presumption in a philosopher, a presumption equaled only by that of him who should assert their existence. How? exclaimed the youth, with a countenance in which astonishment seemed to suspend every other expression. As I never saw the gods, my son, calmly continued the sage, I cannot assert their existence, and that I never saw them is no reason for my denying it. But do we believe nothing except that of which we have ocular demonstration? Nothing, at least, for which we have not the evidence of one or more of our senses. That is, when we believe on just grounds, which I grant, taking men collectively, is very seldom. But where would this spirit lead us? To impiety, to atheism, to all against which I felt confidence in defending the character and philosophy of Epicurus. We will examine presently, my son, into the meaning of the terms you have employed. When you first entered the garden, your mind was unfit for the examination of the subject you have now started. It is no longer so, and we will therefore enter upon the inquiry, and pursue it in order. Forgive me if I acknowledge, said the youth, slightly recoiling from his instructor, some reluctance to enter on the discussion of truths, whose very discussion would seem to argue a doubt, and what then? That very doubt were a crime. If the doubt of any truth shall constitute a crime, then the belief of the same truth should constitute a virtue. Perhaps a duty would rather express it. When you charge the neglect of any duty as a crime, or account of its fulfillment a virtue, you suppose the existence of a power to neglect or fulfill, and it is the exercise of this power, in the one way or the other, which constitutes the merit or demerit. Is it not so? Certainly. Does the human mind possess the power to believe or disbelieve, at pleasure, any truths whatsoever? I am not prepared to answer, but I think it does, since it possesses always the power of investigation, but possibly not the will to exercise the power. Take care lest I beat you with your own weapons. I thought this very investigation appeared to you a crime. Your logic is too subtle, said the youth, for my inexperience. Say rather my reasoning too close. Did I bear you down with sounding words and weighty authorities, and confound your understanding with hair-drawn distinctions, you would be right to retreat from the battery. I have nothing to object to the fairness of your deductions, said Theon, but would not the doctrine be dangerous that should establish our inability to help our belief? And might we not stretch the principle until we asserted our inability to help our actions? We might, and with reason, but we will not now traverse the ethical pons asinorum of necessity, the most simple and evident of mortal truths, and the most darkened, tortured, and belabored by moral teachers. You inquire if the doctrine we have essayed to establish be not dangerous. I reply, not if it be true. Nothing is so dangerous as error, nothing so safe as truth. A dangerous truth would be a contradiction in terms and an anomaly in things. But what is a truth? Said Theon. It is pertinently asked. A truth I consider to be an ascertained fact, which truth would be changed to an error the moment the fact on which it rested was disproved. I see then no fixed basis for truth. It surely has the most fixed of all, the nature of things, and it is only an imperfect insight into that nature which occasions all our erroneous conclusions, whether in physics or morals. But where, if we discard the gods and their will, as engraven on our hearts, are our guides in the search after truth? Our senses and our faculties, as developed in and by the exercise of our senses, are the only guides with which I am acquainted. And I do not see why, even admitting a belief in the gods, and in a superintending providence, the senses should not be viewed as the guides provided by them for our direction and instruction. But here is the evil attendant on an ungrounded belief, whatever be its nature. The moment we take one thing for granted, we take other things for granted. We are started in a wrong road, and it is seldom that we gain the right one, until we have trodden back our steps to the starting place. I know but of one thing that a philosopher should take for granted, and that only because he is forced to by an irresistible impulse of his nature, and because without doing so neither truth nor falsehood could exist for him. He must take for granted the existence of his senses. In other words, he must believe in the existence of things as they exist to his senses. I know of no other existence, and can therefore believe in no other. Although, reasoning from analogy, I may imagine other existences to be. This, for instance, I do as respects the gods. I see around me, in the world I inhabit, an infinite variety in the arrangement of matter, a multitude of sentient beings, possessing different kinds and varying grades of power and intelligence, from the worm that crawls in the dust, to the eagle that soars to the sun, and man who marks to the sun its course. It is possible, it is moreover probable, that in the worlds which I see not, in the boundless infinitude and eternal duration of matter, beings may exist of every countless variety, and varying grades of intelligence, inferior and superior to our own, until we descend to a minimum and rise to a maximum, to which the range of our observation affords no parallel, and of which our senses are inadequate to the conception. Thus far, my young friend, I believe in the gods, or in what you will of existences removed from the sphere of my knowledge. That you should believe, with positiveness, in one unseen existence or another, appears to me no crime, although it may appear to me unreasonable. And so my doubt of the same should appear to you no moral offense, although you might account it erroneous. I fear to fatigue your attention, and will therefore dismiss for the present these abstruse subjects. But we shall both be amply repaid for their discussion, if this truth remain with you, that an opinion, right or wrong, can never constitute a moral offense, nor be in itself a moral obligation. It may be mistaken, it may involve an absurdity or a contradiction. It is a truth, or it is an error. It can never be a crime or a virtue. Chapter 14. Miss Wright was a poetess as well as a politician and writer on ethics. In her 4th of July address, delivered in the New Harmony Hall in 1828, in commemoration of the American independence, is the following: Is there a thought can fill the human mind more pure, more vast, more generous, more refined, than that which guides the enlightened patriot's toil? Not he whose view is bounded by his soil, not he whose narrow heart can only shrine the land, the people that he calleth mine, not he who, to set up that land on high, will make whole nations bleed, whole nations die, not he who, calling that land's rights his pride, trampleth the rights of all the earth beside. No, he it is, the just, the generous soul, who owneth brotherhood with either pole, stretches from realm to realm his spacious mind, and guards the weal of all the human kind, holds freedom's banner o'er the earth unfurled, and stands the guardian patriot of a world. End of chapter 13 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. Read for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Chapter 14 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers, Chapter 14, Epicurus. Epicurean, one who holds the principles of Epicurus, luxurious, contributing to luxury. Epicurism, the principles of Epicurus, luxury, sensual enjoyment, gross pleasure. The words with which this page is headed may be found in the current and established dictionaries of the present day, and it shall be our task to show that never was slander more foul, calumny more base, or libel more cowardly, than when it associated the words luxury and sensuality with the memory of the Athenian Epicurus. The much worn anecdote of the brief endorsed "The defendant has no case, abuse the plaintiff's solicitor," will well apply here. The religionists had no case. The Epicurean philosophy was impregnable as far as theological attacks were concerned, and the theologians have, therefore, constantly and vehemently abused its founder, so that at last children have caught the cry as though it were the enunciation of a fact, and have grown into men believing that Epicurus was a sort of discriminating hog, who wallowed in the filth which some have miscalled pleasure. Epicurus was born in the early part of the year 344 B.C., the third year of the 109th Olympiad at Gargettus, in the neighborhood of Athens. His father, Neocles, was of the Aegean tribe. Some allege that Epicurus was born in the island of Samos, but according to others he was taken there when very young by his parents, who formed a portion of a colony of Athenian citizens sent to colonize Samos after its subjugation by Pericles. The father and mother of Epicurus were in very humble circumstances. His father was a schoolmaster, and his mother, Charistrata, acted as a kind of priestess, curing diseases, exorcising ghosts, and exercising other fabulous powers. Epicurus has been charged with sorcery, because he wrote several songs for his mother's solemn rites. Until 18, he remained at Samos and the neighboring isle of Teos, from whence he removed to Athens, where he resided until the death of Alexander, when disturbances arising, he fled to Colophon. This place, Mitylene and Lampsacus, formed the philosopher's residence until he was 36 years of age, at which time he founded a school in the neighborhood of Athens. He purchased a pleasant garden, where he taught his disciples until the time of his death. We are told by Laertius that those disciples who were regularly admitted into the school of Epicurus lived together, not in the manner of the Pythagoreans, who cast their possessions into a common stock, for this, in his opinion, implied mutual distrust rather than friendship, but upon such a footing of friendly attachment that each individual cheerfully supplied the necessities of his brother. The habits of the philosopher and his followers were temperate and exceedingly frugal, and formed a strong contrast to the luxurious, although refined manners of the Athenians. At the entrance of the garden, the visitor of Epicurus found the following inscription: "The hospitable keeper of this mansion, where you will find pleasure the highest good, will present you with barley cakes and water from the spring. These gardens will not provoke your appetite by artificial dainties, but satisfy it with natural supplies. Will you not then be well entertained?" And yet the owner of the garden, over the gate of which these words were placed, has been called a glutton and a stomach worshipper. From the age of 36 until his decease, he does not seem to have quitted Athens, except temporarily. When Demetrius besieged Athens, the Epicureans were driven into great difficulties for want of food, and it is said that Epicurus and his friends subsisted on a small quantity of beans which he possessed, and which he shared equally with them. The better to prosecute his studies, Epicurus lived a life of celibacy. Temperate and continent himself, he taught his followers to be so likewise, both by example and precept. He died 273 B.C., in the 73rd year of his age, and at that time his warmest opponents seem to have paid the highest compliments to his personal character; and on reading his life, and the detailed accounts of his teachings, it seems difficult to imagine what has induced the calumny which has been heaped upon his memory. We cannot quote from his own works, in his own words, because, although he wrote very much, only a summary of his writings has come to us uninjured. but his doctrines have been so fully investigated and treated on, both by his opponents and his disciples, that there is no difficulty or doubt as to the principles inculcated in the school of Epicurus. The sum of his doctrine concerning philosophy in general is this: Philosophy is the exercise of reason in the pursuit and attainment of a happy life; whence it follows that those studies which conduce neither to the acquisition nor the enjoyment of happiness are to be dismissed as of no value. The end of all speculation ought to be, to enable men to judge with certainty what is to be chosen, and what to be avoided, to preserve themselves free from pain, and to secure health of body and tranquillity of mind. True philosophy is so useful to every man, that the young should apply to it without delay, and the old should never be weary of the pursuit. For no man is either too young or too old to correct and improve his mind, and to study the art of happiness. Happy are they who possess by nature a free and vigorous intellect, and who are born in a country where they can prosecute their inquiries without restraint. For it is philosophy alone which raises a man above vain fears and base passions, and gives him the perfect command of himself. As nothing ought to be dearer to a philosopher than truth, he should pursue it by the most direct means, devising no actions himself, nor suffering himself to be imposed upon by the fictions of others, neither poets, orators, nor logicians, making no other use of the rules of rhetoric or grammar, than to enable him to speak or write with accuracy and perspicuity, and always preferring a plain and simple to an ornamented style. While some doubt of everything, and others profess to acknowledge everything, a wise man will embrace such tenets, and only such as are built upon experience, or upon certain and indisputable axioms. The following is a summary of his moral philosophy: The end of living, or the ultimate good, which is to be sought for its own sake, according to the universal opinion of mankind, is happiness. Yet men, for the most part, fail in the pursuit of this end, either because they do not form a right idea of the nature of happiness, or because they do not make use of proper means to attain it. Since it is every man's interest to be happy through the whole of his life, it is the wisdom of every one to employ philosophy in the search of felicity without delay, and there cannot be a greater folly than to be always beginning to live. The happiness which belongs to man is that state in which he enjoys as many of the good things, and suffers as few of the evils incident to human nature as possible, passing his days in a smooth course of permanent tranquillity. A wise man, though deprived of sight or hearing, may experience happiness in the enjoyment of the good things which yet remain; and when suffering torture, or laboring under some painful disease, can mitigate the anguish by patience, and can enjoy, in his afflictions, the consciousness of his own constancy. But it is impossible that perfect happiness can be possessed without the pleasure which attends freedom from pain, and the enjoyment of the good things of life. Pleasure is in its nature good, as pain is in its nature evil. The one is therefore to be pursued, and the other to be avoided, for its own sake. Pleasure or pain is not only good or evil in itself, but the measure of what is good or evil, in every object of desire or aversion; for the ultimate reason why we pursue one thing and avoid another is because we expect pleasure from the former and apprehend pain from the latter. If we sometimes decline a present pleasure, it is not because we are averse to pleasure itself, but because we conceive that in the present instance it will be necessarily connected with a greater pain. In like manner, if we sometimes voluntarily submit to a present pain, it is because we judge that it is necessarily connected with a greater pleasure. Although all pleasure is essentially good, and all pain essentially evil, it doth not thence necessarily follow that in every single instance the one ought to be pursued, and the other to be avoided. But reason is to be employed in distinguishing and comparing the nature and degrees of each, that the result may be a wise choice of that which shall appear to be, upon the whole, good. That pleasure is the first good, appears from the inclination which every animal, from its first birth, discovers to pursue pleasure, and avoid pain, and is confirmed by the universal experience of mankind, who are incited to action by no other principle than the desire of avoiding pain or obtaining pleasure. There are two kinds of pleasure, one consisting in a state of rest, in which both body and mind are undisturbed by any kind of pain; the other arising from an agreeable agitation of the senses, producing a correspondent emotion in the soul. It is upon the former of these that the enjoyment of life chiefly depends. Happiness may therefore be said to consist in bodily ease and mental tranquillity. When pleasure is asserted to be the end of living, we are not then to understand that violent kind of delight or joy which arises from the gratification of the senses and passions, but merely that placid state of mind which results from the absence of every cause of pain or uneasiness. Those pleasures which arise from agitation are not to be pursued as in themselves the end of living, but as means of arriving at that stable tranquillity in which true happiness consists. It is the office of reason to confine the pursuit of pleasure within the limits of nature, in order to the attainment of that happy state in which the body is free from every kind of pain, and the mind from all perturbation. This state must not, however, be conceived to be perfect in proportion as it is inactive and torpid, but in proportion as all the functions of life are quietly and pleasantly performed. A happy life neither resembles a rapid torrent nor a standing pool, but is like a gentle stream that glides smoothly and silently along. This happy state can only be obtained by a prudent care of the body and a steady government of the mind. The diseases of the body are to be prevented by temperance, or cured by medicine, or rendered tolerable by patience. Against the diseases of the mind, philosophy provides sufficient antidotes. The instruments which it employs for this purpose are the virtues, the root of which, whence all the rest proceed, is prudence. This virtue comprehends the whole art of living discreetly, justly, and honorably, and is, in fact, the same thing with wisdom. It instructs men to free their understandings from the clouds of prejudice, to exercise temperance and fortitude in the government of themselves, and to practice justice towards others. Although pleasure or happiness, which is the end of living, be superior to virtue, which is only the means, it is every one's interest to practice all the virtues, for in a happy life pleasure can never be separated from virtue. A prudent man, in order to secure his tranquillity, will consult his natural disposition in the choice of his plan of life. If, for example, he be persuaded that he should be happier in a state of marriage than in celibacy, he ought to marry. But if he be convinced that matrimony would be an impediment to his happiness, he ought to remain single. In like manner, such persons as are naturally active, enterprising, and ambitious, or such as, by the condition of their birth, are placed in the way of civil offices, should accommodate themselves to their nature and situation by engaging in public affairs; while such as are, from natural temper, fond of leisure and retirement, or, from experience or observation, are convinced that a life of public business would be inconsistent with their happiness, are unquestionably at liberty, except where particular circumstances call them to the service of their country, to pass their lives in obscure repose. Temperance is that discreet regulation of the desires and passions by which we are enabled to enjoy pleasures without suffering any consequent inconvenience. They who maintain such a constant self command as never to be enticed by the prospect of present indulgence to do that which will be productive of evil, obtain the truest pleasure by declining pleasure; since of desires some are natural and necessary, others are natural but not necessary, and others neither natural nor necessary, but the offspring of false judgment, it must be the office of temperance to gratify the first class as far as nature requires, to restrain the second within the bounds of moderation, and as to the third, resolutely to oppose, and, if possible, entirely repress them. Sobriety, as opposed to inebriety and gluttony, is of admirable use in teaching men that nature is satisfied with a little, and enabling them to content themselves with simple and frugal fare. Such a manner of living is conducive to the preservation of health, renders a man alert and active in all the offices of life, affords him an exquisite relish of the occasional varieties of a plentiful board, and prepares him to meet every reverse of fortune without the fear of want. Continence is a branch of temperance which prevents the diseases, infamy, remorse, and punishment to which those are exposed who indulge themselves in unlawful amours. Music and poetry, which are often employed as incentives to licentious pleasure, are to be cautiously and sparingly used. Gentleness, as opposed to an irascible temper, greatly contributes to the tranquillity and happiness of life, by preserving the mind from perturbation, and arming it against the assaults of calumny and malice. A wise man who puts himself under the government of reason will be able to receive an injury with calmness, and to treat the person who committed it with lenity; for he will rank injuries among the casual events of life, and will prudently reflect that he can no more stop the natural current of human passions than he can curb the stormy winds. Refractory servants in a family should be chastised, and disorderly members of a state punished without wrath. Moderation in the pursuit of honors or riches is the only security against disappointment and vexation. A wise man, therefore, will prefer the simplicity of rustic life to the magnificence of courts. Future events a wise man will consider as uncertain, and will therefore neither suffer himself to be elated with confident expectation, nor to be depressed by doubt and despair, for both are equally destructive of tranquillity. It will contribute to the enjoyment of life to consider death as the perfect termination of a happy life, which it becomes us to close like satisfied guests, neither regretting the past nor anxious for the future. Fortitude, the virtue which enables us to endure pain and to banish fear, is of great use in producing tranquillity. Philosophy instructs us to pay homage to the gods, not through hope or fear, but from veneration of their superior nature. It moreover enables us to conquer the fear of death, by teaching us that it is no proper object of terror, since whilst we are, death is not, and when death arrives, we are not; so that it neither concerns the living nor the dead. The only evils to be apprehended are bodily pain and distress of mind. Bodily pain it becomes a wise man to endure with patience and firmness, because if it be slight, it may easily be borne, and if it be intense, it cannot last long. Mental distress commonly arises not from nature, but from opinion. A wise man will therefore arm himself against this kind of suffering, by reflecting that the gifts of fortune, the loss of which he may be inclined to deplore, were never his own, but depended upon circumstances which he could not command. If, therefore, they happen to leave him, he will endeavor as soon as possible to obliterate the remembrance of them, by occupying his mind in pleasant contemplation, and engaging in agreeable avocations. Justice respects man as living in society, and is the common bond without which no society can subsist. This virtue, like the rest, derives its value from its tendency to promote the happiness of life. Not only is it never injurious to the man who practices it, but nourishes in his mind calm reflections and pleasant hopes, whereas it is impossible that the mind in which injustice dwells should not be full of disquietude. Since it is impossible that iniquitous actions should promote the enjoyment of life, as much as remorse of conscience, legal penalties, and public disgrace must increase its troubles, every one who follows the dictates of sound reason will practice the virtues of justice, equity, and fidelity. In society, the necessity of the mutual exercise of justice, in order to the common enjoyment of the gifts of nature, is the ground of those laws by which it is prescribed. It is the interest of every individual in a state to conform to the laws of justice; for by injuring no one, and rendering to every man his due, he contributes his part towards the preservation of that society, upon the perpetuity of which his own safety depends. Nor ought any one to think that he is at liberty to violate the rights of his fellow citizens, provided he can do it securely. For he who has committed an unjust action can never be certain that it will not be discovered, and however successfully he may conceal it from others, this will avail him little, since he cannot conceal it from himself. In different communities, different laws may be instituted, according to the circumstances of the people who compose them. Whatever is thus prescribed is to be considered as a rule of justice, so long as the society shall judge the observance of it to be for the benefit of the whole. But whenever any rule of conduct is found upon experience not to be conducive to the public good, being no longer useful, it should no longer be prescribed. Nearly allied to justice are the virtues of beneficence, compassion, gratitude, piety, and friendship. He who confers benefits upon others, procures to himself the satisfaction of seeing the stream of plenty spreading around him from the fountain of his beneficence. At the same time he enjoys the pleasure of being esteemed by others. The exercise of gratitude, filial affection, and reverence for the gods, is necessary in order to avoid the hatred and contempt of all men. Friendships are contracted for the sake of mutual benefit, but by degrees they ripen into such disinterested attachment that they are continued without any prospect of advantage. Between friends there is a kind of league, that each will love the other as himself. A true friend will partake of the wants and sorrows of his friend, as if they were his own. If he be in want, he will relieve him; if he be in prison, he will visit him; if he be sick, he will come to him. Nay, situations may occur in which he would not scruple to die for him. It cannot then be doubted that friendship is one of the most useful means of procuring a secure, tranquil, and happy life. No man will, we think, find anything in the foregoing summary to justify the foul language used against Epicurus, and his moral philosophy. The secret is in the physical doctrines, and this secret is, that Epicurus was actually, if not intentionally, an atheist. The following is a summary of his physical doctrine. Nothing can ever spring from nothing, nor can anything ever return to nothing. The universe always existed, and will always remain. For there is nothing into which it can be changed. There is nothing in nature, nor can anything be conceived besides body and space. Body is that which possesses the properties of bulk, figure, resistance, and gravity. It is this alone which can touch or be touched. Space is the region which is or may be occupied by body, and which affords it an opportunity of moving freely. That there are bodies in the universe is attested by the senses. That there is also space is evident, since otherwise bodies would have no place in which to move or exist, and of their existence and motion we have the certain proof of perception. Besides these, no third nature can be conceived, for such a nature must either have bulk and solidity, or want them; that is, it must either be a body or space. This does not, however, preclude the existence of qualities which have no subsistence but in the body to which they belong. The universe, consisting of body and space, is infinite, for it has no limits. Bodies are infinite in multitude. Space is infinite in magnitude. The term above or beneath, high or low, cannot be properly applied to infinite space. The universe is to be conceived as immovable, since beyond it there is no place into which it can move; and as eternal and immutable, since it is neither liable to increase nor decrease, to production nor decay. Nevertheless, the parts of the universe are in motion, and are subject to change. All bodies consist of parts, of which they are composed, and into which they may be resolved; and these parts are either themselves simple principles, or may be resolved into such. These first principles, or simple atoms, are divisible by no force, and therefore must be immutable. This may also be inferred from the uniformity of nature, which could not be preserved if its principles were not certain and consistent. The existence of such atoms is evident, since it is impossible that anything which exists should be reduced to nothing. A finite body cannot consist of parts infinite, either in magnitude or number. Divisibility of bodies ad infinitum is therefore conceivable. All atoms are of the same nature, or differ in no essential qualities. From their different effects upon the senses it appears, however, that they differ in magnitude, figure, and weight. Atoms exist in every possible variety of figure, round, oval, conical, cubical, sharp, hooked, etc. But in every shape they are, on account of their solidity, infrangible, or incapable of actual division. Gravity must be an essential property of atoms, for since they are perpetually in motion, or making an effort to move, they must be moved by an internal impulse, which may be called gravity. The principle of gravity, that internal energy which is the cause of all motion, whether simple or complex, being essential to the primary corpuscles or atoms, they must have been incessantly, and from eternity, in actual motion. Epicurus, who boasts that he was an inquirer and a philosopher in his 13th year, was scarcely likely to bow his mind to the mythology of his country. The man who, when he was but a schoolboy, insisted upon an answer to the question, whence came chaos, could hardly be expected to receive as admitted facts the fabulous legends as to Jupiter and the other gods. His theology is, however, in some respects obscure and unintelligible, for while he zealously opposed the popular fables, which men misname God ideas, he at the same time admitted the existence of material gods, whom he placed in the intervals between the infinite worlds, where they passed a life undisturbed by aught, and enjoyed a happiness which does not admit of augmentation. These inactive gods play a strange part in the system of Epicurus, and it is asserted by many that these extraordinary conceptions of deity were put forward by the philosopher to screen him from the consequences attaching to a charge of atheism. Dr. Heinrich Ritter, who does not seem very friendly disposed towards Epicurus or his philosophy, repudiates this notion, and argues Epicurus was not in truth an atheist, and alleges that it was a mere pretense on his part, and that from his very theory of knowledge the existence of gods could be deduced. This has been much litigated. Vide Electric Review for 1806, page 606. It is quite evident that Epicurus neither regarded the gods in the capacity of creators, controllers, or rulers, so that his theism, if it be theism, was not of a very superstitious character. The God who neither created man nor exercised any influence whatever over his actions or thinkings could have but little to do with man at all. If we attempt to review the whole of the teachings of Epicurus, we and they are defective and imperfect in many respects, and necessarily so. We say necessarily so, because the imperfect science of the day limited the array of facts presented to the philosopher, and narrowed the base upon which he was to erect his system. We must expect, therefore, to find the structure weak in many points, because it was too large for the foundation. But we are not, therefore, to pass it on one side, and without further notice. It should rather be our task to lay good, wide, and sure foundations, on which to build up a system, and develop a method, really having for its end the happiness of mankind. We live 2000 years later than the Athenian philosopher. In those 2000 years, many facts have been dragged out of the circle of the unknown and unused. Astronomy, geology, physiology, psychology, all except theology, are better understood. Men pretend they are searching after happiness, and where do they try to find it? Not here amongst the known, but in the possible hereafter amongst the unknowable. How do they try to find it? Not by the aid of the known, not by the light of facts, gathered in years of toil, and sanctified by the blood of some of the noblest of truth's noble martyrs. No, but in the darkness of the unknown and unknowable, in the next world. Question the men who fly to theology for happiness, and they will tell you that the most learned of the theologians sum up their knowledge in the word incomprehensible. Is it wonderful that their happiness is somewhat marred here by quarrels as to the true definition of hereafter? G. H. Lewes says of the Epicurean philosophy that the attempt failed because the basis was not broad enough. The Epicureans are therefore to be regarded as men who ventured on a great problem and failed because they only saw part of the truth. And we might add that Christianity and every other religious entity fails because the professors expect to obtain happiness in the next life and neglect to work for it in the present one. Epicurus says no life can be pleasant except a virtuous life, and he charges you to avoid whatever may be calculated to create disquiet in the mind, or give pain to the body. The Reverend Habakkuk Smilino of Bethel says that all pleasure here is vanity and vexation in the hereafter, and he charges you to continually worry and harass your mind with fears that you may be condemned to hell, and doubts whether you will be permitted to enter heaven. Which is the best, the philosophy of Epicurus or the theology of Smilino? G. H. Levis says, Epicureanism, in leading man to a correct appreciation of the moral end of his existence, in showing him how to be truly happy, has to combat with many obstructions, which hide from him the real road of life. These obstructions are his illusions, his prejudices, his errors, his ignorance. The ignorance is of two kinds, as Victor Cousin points out. Ignorance of the laws of the external world, which creates absurd superstition, and troubles the mind with false fears and false hopes. Hence the necessity of some knowledge of physics. We can scarcely blame Epicurus that he was not in advance of his time, as far as the physical sciences are concerned, and therefore imparted an imperfect system of physics. We must, with our improved knowledge ourselves, remove the obstruction. The second kind of ignorance is that of the nature of man. Socrates had taught men to regard their own nature as the great object of investigation, and this lesson Epicurus willingly gave ear to. But man does not interrogate his own nature out of simple curiosity or simple erudition. He studies his nature in order that he may improve it. He learns the extent of his capacities in order that he may properly direct them. The aim, therefore, of all such inquiries must be happiness. We may add that the result of all such inquiries will be happiness, if the inquirer will but base his investigation and experiments upon facts. Let him understand that as he improves the circumstances which surround him, so will he advance himself, becoming happier, and making his fellows happy also. Remember the words of Epicurus, and seek that pleasure for yourself which appears the most durable, and attended with the greatest pleasure to your fellow men. End of chapter 14 of Ancient and Modern Celebrated Freethinkers by Charles Bradlaugh. Recorded for you by Ted DeLorme in Fort Mill, South Carolina.